you wanna, Yusuf, you wanna come a little bit closer so I can just. I know the pillar you're leaning. Yeah, no worries. Can you hear me from here? Yeah. Okay, as long as I don't have to scream my. If you've got a phone, what do you want to put in the pin? Game pin. So the pin is 201350. So what we'll do is I did the quiz to be set up as a revision, but not the full, just the first half of what we've done so far, and then inshallah next week we'll do the second half of what we've done. So it's 201350. So you go to www.kahoot.it. Oh, that's a character. That's what they mean. Are you joining us? Oh, you changed it? You want to be the duck? The wolf suits you better. Have you got in, Yusuf? www.kahoot, K-A-H. You having data issues?
No, I can get to the website. I can put in my pin, but I need my enter.
201350?
Try a different, yeah, I think it's just the browser.
Oh, there you are. All right. Shall we start? Yeah. All right. Oh, there's a few more people. We're just about to start. Do you want to join the quiz? We're just about to. Okay. All right, let's start the quiz. You ready? Which of these is not true about the Prophet's features? He had broad shoulders. He was taller than most people. His skin color was white with a redness. He had thick hands and feet. Which is not true? Oh no, both of you guys got it wrong. He was taller than most people. He was of average height. He was neither taller nor shorter. That was the description. Neither. Zero. At the time, which of these was not one of the three groups of Arabs? Pure Arabs, perished Arabs, Arabized Arabs, Adnanian Arabs. At the time, the Prophet ﷺ, there was a concept that there was three groups of Arabs. Pure Arabs, perished Arabs, Arabized Arabs, Adnani. Not. Which of these were not? No, again. It was, so the Adnanian Arabs were not part of the three groups. The pure Arabs, perished, and Arabized Arabs were the three groups of Arabs. Okay, next one. Qusay was the son of Abdul Manaf. Sorry, that's supposed to be Abdul Manaf. And who was the son of Abdul Manaf? Sorry, Qusay's son was Abdul Manaf. Abdul Manaf's son was Shaiba, Hashim, Abdul Muttalib, Abdullah. Qusay's son was Abdul Manaf. It was Hashim. So someone got that right. No? Oh yeah, Brother Bilal, you got it right. How many camels did Abdul Muttalib sacrifice to save his son Abdullah? 20, 50, 100, 200. It was 100. Prophet Muhammad was born in which year? 470 AD, 570 AD, 575 AD, or 750 AD? The Prophet was born in which year? Yeah, you got that right, 57. Usually people find the dates difficult. Like the years, everyone gets it wrong, but you guys got the years right. Bedouin couple that fostered the Prophet was Hamza and Halima. True or false? True or false? The Bedouin couple that fostered the Prophet was Hamza and Halima. False. It was Harith and Halima. Trick question. It was Harith and Halima. Prophet's earliest job was looking after camels, looking after caravans, looking after goats, looking after sheep. It was looking after sheep. And the Prophet said all prophets would look after sheep. That was their job. And the reason scholars say that was because unlike goats and camels, if you are abusive towards the sheep, if you're hard and rough, the sheep will run away, whereas goats and camels will still follow you. So it was teaching the prophets how to care for a flock with kindness. True or false? The Prophet received revelation at the cave of Nur on the mountain of Hira. True or false? Yeah, so this is again trick. It's actually the cave of Hira on the mountain Jabal Nur. I put the two the other way around. So this is tricky questions. Question 9. Which two locations do we have historical evidence of the moon being split? China and India, Spain and England, England and India, Spain and China. So we have historical records of people witnessing the moon splitting from which countries? China and India, Spain and England, England and India, Spain and China. England and India. There was a monastery with monks that wrote that they saw the moon splitting in England. And in India, it was a king who actually saw the moon split and who came to the Prophet ﷺ because of that and became Muslim. Yeah. Omar embraced Islam after hearing which surah? Surah Taha, Surah Al-Qasas, Surah Fusilat, Surah Haqqaq. Surah.
Story is Taha, but it's about something else.
Is it really? Most seerahs say Surah Taha, that he heard Surah Taha.
But there are some ulama who say it's not Surah Taha. They have some reasons for it. I don't
Because he was
know.
listening during the, he was hiding once behind the Kaaba.
Which city was Adas, the slave in Taif, from? Adas, the slave in Taif, which city was he from? Mecca, Jerusalem, Yathrib, or Nineveh? Nineveh. Remember the Prophet ﷺ, when he was in Taif, he got stoned and he saw the slave and he brought some grapes and he said, where are you from? And he said, Nineveh. And he said, oh, from the city of my brother, the Prophet Yunus.
Yeah.
And others was quite surprised by that. The first recorded Muslim jinns were Turkish from the city of Nasabin, Jewish from the city of Jerusalem, Persian from the city of Babylon, or Indian from the city of Delhi. The first recorded jinns that became Muslim. They were Turkish. They were from the city of Nasabin. The Prophet ﷺ said they were a group of jinns who came from Nasabin and traveling, and they heard the Prophet ﷺ reciting Quran.
Then what about when the jinns overheard the recitation and they
There was a
Masjid jinn is there?
There was that later. This was the first jinns. That came later. That's where the jinns fought, had a battle. But this one was the group first heard it and became Muslim. So, Brother Bilal comes first place.
Yeah.
So because we had a bit of a gap, I thought we'll start with a description of the Prophet ﷺ. And today's description is about how he walked. So, we have been told by Qutayb ibn Sa'id, Abu Lahi, on the authority of Abu Yunus, that Abu Huraira said, I have not seen anything more beautiful than the Allah's Messenger. The sun seemed to shine in his face, nor have I seen any more rapid in his gait than Allah's Messenger. The earth seemed to be folded up for him. We must strenuously exert ourselves while he is not subject to any stress. What he's saying is when the Prophet ﷺ used to walk, he would walk quite with a purpose, and he would walk fast. And the Sahaba would have to actually exert themselves to keep up with him. There's other narrations that say the Prophet ﷺ would walk as if he was walking downhill. So long, big strides, and he will get to the point where he wants. He wouldn't, walk around and waste time.
And also thinking the people, his appearance to the people seemed that he was bigger than life.
That's right. He wasn't actually taller physically, but whenever he walked into a room, you felt his presence. It was, he had those personalities that filled the room up when he walked in. So where we ended many, many months ago, and I apologize for the huge break, was at the Battle of Uhud. The Battle of Uhud had just finished, and we are in the 16th, so the 19 years of Revelation. So we're in the 16th year after Revelation. Now what we will cover today is from year 16 after Revelation to 19 years, so 2-year period, which we'll cover today, inshallah. So Uhud had just finished. We're still in the battlefield. The dust settles, and the Quraysh have now occupied the battlefield. The remaining Muslims, or people from Medina, have been pushed into the mountains of Uhud, or to the base of Uhud, and the Quraysh have taken over the battlefield. What they start doing is quite barbaric. They start mutilating the bodies of the Medinans. We know the famous occasion where Hind cuts open the chest of Hamza radiallahu anhu and eats the liver, but it was not only Hamza, they did that to nearly everybody they could find. Abu Amir,
Was that a custom or just to get swiped?
it wasn't a custom. The book doesn't say, but I don't think it was a custom. The reason why I don't think it's a custom is because when the Muslims came to the battlefield and saw the mutilated bodies, they were shocked. So I assume if it was a custom, they wouldn't have been that shocked. Allahu, I'm not sure. But Abu Amir was a Quraysh, and he was fighting on the side of the Quraysh, but his son Hanzala was a Muslim who had converted to Islam, and he was fighting on the side of the Muslims. Does Hanzala ring a bell?
Yes.
What's famous about Hanzala? Can't remember.
The Rasil of the Malaika, the Malaika washed him.
Yes. Hanzala was the Sahaba who just got married the day before. He got married the day before and then he was running late, so he ran to catch up with the army. He unfortunately was killed on the battlefield. And so Abu Amir saw his son Hanzala there, and he begged the Quraysh not to mutilate his body. And because he begged, they left that body alone, whereas all the other bodies they mutilated.
And he was the one who the angels came and bathed him.
That's right. So because his body was left alone, when the Muslims came to the battlefield after the Quraysh had left and they were picking up the dead, they saw Hanzala's body and it was actually wet. And the Prophet ﷺ said, this is the angels who've done wusul had washed his body. And they say that the entire body was wet with water. Now, the Quraysh start to leave the battlefield, and as they're leaving, Abu Sufyan shouts out to the Prophet ﷺ, you've won one battle, we've won one battle, the third one will be the one that decides everything. We will come back in a few years and we'll have a third battle. And the Prophet ﷺ agrees and says, yes, come and we'll see what happens.
When did Abu Sufyan become Muslim?
Later, much later. Much later, actually it's after the conquest as well.
He was the father of Ikrimah.
Yes, much later.
Just before conquest.
Was it just before? He ran away and then
Abu Sufyan.
Abu Sufyan, I thought it was just after the conquest.
Just not before, I think, not before the conquest.
Maybe. It was during the conquest. It was because of the conquest, really.
Not before.
Because the Prophet ﷺ said that those who stay in Abu Sufyan's house will be protected.
Yes.
Yeah. So it was the night before. Now the other thing is, it's interesting. Now Abu Sufyan's been always a very strong enemy of Islam till he converts. He's always been against it. But you can see certain traits in him that were honorable. He always had certain traits that were honorable. For example, when he went to Heraclius in Byzantine, he told the truth. He said, yep, the Muslims love the Prophet. He does say things that are true. Similarly, when he saw the mutilated bodies, Abu Sufyan said, I didn't stop them, but I didn't encourage them either. So he had a bit of a hesitation of what was happening. Now, Abu Sufyan makes this challenge, and the Prophet ﷺ says, okay, challenge accepted. The third battle will be the deciding battle. But some scholars, especially European scholars, say that Uhud was a loss to the Muslims and was a victory to the Quraysh. Not quite true. Not quite true. And I'm not saying this as a Muslim because we don't want to accept that the Quraysh. It's not quite true because the goal of the Quraysh was to completely annihilate the Muslims. They were planning to go into Medina. They were going to walk into Medina and destroy Medina. They couldn't do that. The reason was that Uhud was such a difficult battle that the Quraysh were exhausted after it. They were totally exhausted. But also, remember when the Muslims were coming to Uhud, Abdullah ibn, I've forgotten his name, Abdullah ibn, who was the hypocrite? Abdullah ibn Umayr, I've forgotten his name. Abdullah ibn Ubay. You know how when they were coming to Uhud, him and 300 others went back? Now, this is interesting. When they went back, for me, when I read that, I thought, well, that's a horrible thing. Now there's less soldiers. But Allah made it so that it actually became a positive thing. Because those 300 fresh soldiers were in Medina, the Quraysh were too scared to fight. They didn't want to, they were so exhausted, they didn't want to go to Medina and fight 300 fresh soldiers. So they left Medina alone. Now, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ comes down to the battle, from Uhud comes down to the battlefield, and he sees the mutilated bodies, and he is devastated. These are people that he loved, his companions, his Sahaba, his uncle, and it breaks his heart not only to see them dead, but the bodies chopped up and arms, legs missing. He's so angry that he says, the next time we fight, I will mutilate 30 bodies of theirs. Rasulullah said this, right? Because 22 Muslims had died at the Battle of Uhud. He says, and 22 were mutilated. He said 30 will be mutilated. And just then, Surah Nahl, chapter 16, verse 126 is revealed. And so if you can bring consequences against them, don't bring any consequences against them that are worse than what you have suffered. However, if you persevere patiently instead and suppress the urge to retaliate, then that's the best for those who are patient. We've seen throughout the Seerah an interesting thing, which I find very interesting. There are several revelations which, sometimes gently, sometimes a bit sternly, reprimand the Prophet ﷺ himself. We know the time of when he looked away from Abdullah, the blind Sahaba. This is another one. And it says, if you are... Abdullah ibn Maktoum. Yeah, his first name's Abdullah. It's like, if you are going to retaliate, the retaliation has to be at the level that you suffered. You cannot say, I'm going to do one up. This troubled the Prophet ﷺ so much that he actually said, mutilation of bodies from here on for every Muslim is banned. Doesn't matter how bad, a body is a body that should be respected. And this is why in Islam, in the rules of battlefield, you do not mutilate the bodies of enemies. It's not allowed, it's haram. It's because this revelation came and it shook him so much. Similarly, the scholars actually say that for Muslims, we are not allowed to escalate a situation. When things go bad, when there's a fight or a problem, it is in our sunnah to de-escalate if possible. If not possible, keep it at the same level. But we are not the people that escalate problems. We don't do tit for tat and increase the issue. And it's straight from the Quran. Yes, and the
revelation came for that.
Yes, and there's the chainmail that he was wearing actually got embedded into his cheeks. I think it was Talha. I think it was Talha who had to. They tried to pull it out, but it was so embedded that he had to use his teeth. He used the teeth to pull the chain mail in from his face out. So this slide here shows you the number of deaths comparison. The Meccans are the blue ones. 22 died. They had how many? 3,000 Meccans came to the battlefield. Of the 3,000, 22 died. Muslims, there were 700 Muslims that joined the battle. Oh, sorry, I have to stop saying Muslims. There's a reason why I stopped saying Muslims. Let's call them the Medinans, and I'll tell you why. There were 700 Medinans. Of the 700, 70 Medinans died. Of the Medinans, 65 were Ansar, 4 were Muhajirun, and the reason why I say Medinans and not Muslims, because one was, anyone guess? There was one who died in the Uhud on the side of the Muslims who was Jewish. There was a Jewish person who died, and we'll talk about him in a second. So, some of the martyrs that died: Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib, Abdullah ibn Jash, Hanzala ibn Abi Amir, Hanzala that we talked about, who just got married the day before, Khaytham Abu Sa'd. Now, Khaytham Abu Sa'd was one of the men who persuaded the Prophet to march out to Uhud so that he could be martyred and join his son in paradise as he saw in his dream. Remember, I don't know if you remember, but we said that there was a person who saw his son who had been martyred earlier at Badr, and he saw in his dream that he's going to join him. And just as he saw in his dream, he did. Thabit ibn Dadaha. Just a few months ago, Thabit ibn Dadaha had traded in the orchard of palm trees of Abu Lubaba's single tree in order to give it to an orphan. After Thabit's death, the Prophet remarked, "Palms with low-hanging, heavy-laden clusters, with a multitude of these, had the son of Dadaha in paradise." So Thabit was special in that he saw a slave, a Muslim slave, and he wanted to free him, but the master would refuse. He said, "No, I'm not going to slave him." So he said, "I will exchange an entire orchard of date palm trees for this one person." And when he passed away, the Prophet ﷺ said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala compensated him for that by giving him an orchard in paradise. The other people who died, Usayrim. Usayrim had become a Muslim that morning. And he was known as the man who entered paradise without having prayed a single prayer. He became a Muslim in the morning, joined Uhud, didn't get a chance to pray a single prayer, and died. But the Sahaba were so envious of him because they said he died spotless. There is a similar story of many years later when Khalid ibn Walid is fighting the Byzantines. And the Byzantine general sends a messenger to Khalid to negotiate, to avoid the battle. But the messenger comes and sees the Muslims and how they are and how Khalid speaks, that he becomes Muslim and refuses to go back. And in his Byzantine armor, in the Roman armor, he goes and fights his own side and dies. So literally within minutes of becoming Muslim, he passes away. So that's another story. But in this case, Usayrim was the person who died straight away. And the last person was Mukhayrik. He was a rabbi from the Jewish clan of Talaba, and he's found amongst the dead. Now Mukhayrik urged his people to keep the covenant with the Prophet, but they refused. So he left for Uhud by himself. And when the Prophet ﷺ saw the body of Mukhayrik, the Prophet said, "He is the best of Jews." Interesting thing to remember is we tend to we see the current political situation, and we understand that you know what's happening, and we tend to get quite angry, and we say, "Oh, the Jews are doing this and that," and it's fair. I'm not saying it's unfair; it's fair. But we also have to remember there were some amazing Jews who supported the Prophet ﷺ. There were a lot of the converts in Medina were Jewish, so their religion changed, but their ethnicity was still Jewish. Abdullah ibn Salam, one of the great rabbis of Medina, and became Muslim and supported the Prophet ﷺ. And Mukhayrik never became Muslim. He was a Jew. Mukhayrik, who died, he was a rabbi. He never became Muslim. He died as a Jew. But the Prophet ﷺ respected him so much that he said he is the best of Jews.
So, he died outside the state of Islam.
no book says he was a Muslim. He joined because he said, I have a pact with the Prophet, I will keep that pact. And he left all by himself. None of his clan or any of his family joined him. He went by himself to say, I made this pact and I will keep it. And the Prophet ﷺ respected and appreciated him for that. So this is why I didn't say Muslims. I said Medinans.
So would he be considered as Shaheed?
I thought the same question. I don't think so, but Allahu Alam. Maybe he became Muslim just before he passed away. We will never know until we go to Jannah.
You said notable Muslims, that's Khalid bin Walid.
No, Khalid bin Walid wasn't. He's still very much alive.
You already listed notable Muslims, Khalid.
Notable Muslims killed at Uhud: Hamza, Abdul ibn Jash, Musab, Khaythama Abu Sa'd.
Killed, I got it.
Killed. So, who won the war? Who actually won Uhud? This is written by a non-Muslim, but it's very interesting. This is a historian. His surname is what? He says this: in trying to make an assessment of the Battle of Uhud, the first question to ask is purely a military one. Who won the battle? Who had the advantage in it? Some Western scholars, not without justification, from the early Muslim accounts have thought that it was a very serious defeat for the Muslims and a great victory for the Meccans. From the military standpoint, this view is mistaken. The strategic aim of the Meccans was nothing less than the destruction of the Muslim community as such, or what amounts to the same thing, the removal of Muhammad from his position of influence in Medina. This aim they completely failed to achieve. What humiliation for the proud merchant princes of Mecca. It was an intimidation that the end of their commercial empire was at hand. For Muhammad, on the other hand, the purely military result of the battle was not wholly unsatisfactory. The Muslims had shown themselves almost equal to the Meccans. Their infantry was more than a match for their opponents. The Muslims' casualties were mostly due to the enemy cavalry, and the Muslims were still too poor to have a cavalry squadron of their own. Despite this weakness, however, Muhammad ﷺ had managed to hold his own against the Meccans, and that was all that was needed to do at that moment. I thought that's a beautiful description of what actually happened. What happened was there was two goals. The Muslims' goal was to hold on to what they have and not be destroyed. They had 700 soldiers versus 3,000. The Meccans' goal was to completely annihilate the Muslims, if not at least to kill the Prophet ﷺ. Now, after Uhud, which goal was achieved? There was more Muslims that died, but the goal of the Muslims was achieved. They held their ground despite the losses. They held their ground so much that they made the Quraysh too scared to fight to go to Medina. From a military point of view, the reason, we're talking completely military, the reason why the defeat happened was, one, the archers didn't listen to what the Prophet ﷺ said, but it was because the Meccans had cavalry led by, who led the cavalry of the Meccans? Khalid ibn Walid. The Muslims had zero cavalry. They had archers and they had infantry, but they didn't have any, they couldn't afford it. They didn't have the money for horses. So it's a very I really like his analysis of Uhud. Now, the Muslim women who were in the baggage area, usually when there's a battle, Muslim women accompany their men. They stay in this baggage area or the camp. They come down to the field and they start weeping because they see now how their loved ones are not only dead, but they are mutilated. And the only comfort they get is that they remind themselves of Surah Al-Baqarah chapter 2, verse 153 to 157. I won't read each of the surahs because we'll be here till Fajr if I do that. But if you can remember, try to remember and go home and read them. Surah Baqarah, 153 to 157, which comforts them in this really hard time. The Prophet ﷺ, now get this, the Prophet ﷺ has been injured, he's wounded, his face, like I said, had chainmail in him, his cheek is pierced with a spear, but he spends the rest of the day praying and burying every single Muslim. He prayed over every single of those 69 Muslims. And he buried each of them with his hands, 69 of them. And he's not a young person, imagine. He must be exhausted. With so many Muslims that have been martyred, There is another issue that has come up. Anyone know what this other problem that the Muslims have to face?
The Quran, the Hafiz of the Quran.
No, not yet. That becomes later, but not yet. The women. There's too many widows and too many orphans and not enough men now. And what can you do now? They go back to Medina, not half, but large portion of the men are not there. Their husbands are not there. And it was in response to this that Surah Nisa, verse 3 is revealed, which is, if any of you men fear that you might not be able to treat the orphan with justice, by being tempted to marry them for their money while they have no guardian to look after their interests, then marry women for your choice, up to 2, 3, or 4. If you are afraid that you might not be able to treat them equally, then marry only one, or marry who is under your authority. This will help you keep from committing injustice. This is where the ruling comes of limitation of 4. It is to encourage the Muslims to look after those women who are orphan and the children. But there's a threshold, because prior to this there was no limitation. You could marry as many as you wanted. And not only in Islam, in any other religion, there was no limit on marriage numbers. I mean, the Byzantines had many wives. You take the Byzantine Empire, he had a harem, right? But in Islam, for the first time in any religion, there's a limit. And this is when the limit comes.
Subsequently, when Rasulullah was given limit for the number of wives,
The Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam? The Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, I don't think the limit applied to him because he had to.
no, not this limit, but subsequently.
Okay, there was a limit given to him. I haven't come across that yet, but if I do, you know, okay.
At the same time, I wish all these dais, always this question comes up due to racism and all that. They mention about the Surah Nisa and they mention about this limitation. But I wish, they proceed this
Why?
Surah with the historical incident.
Context of it, yeah.
What happened, of course, some do mention that about the martyrdom of the Muslims
Yeah.
in 1969, and that's the reason the surah came to.
That's right. And it's funny, they use this surah to say it encourages people to marry 4 wives. Actually, it's the opposite. It tells you there's a limitation and then encourages you to stick to one if you cannot be treating everyone equally. It literally says better to marry one if you can't treat all 4 equally.
Surah was revealed soon after
Uhud.
this martyrdom, isn't it?
That's right. Straight after Uhud.
So that should be always highlighted, because when people bring this up over and over again, there is historical
Reasons behind it. Exactly.
In Germany, after World War II, the German government encouraged men to marry more than one because there were too many.
It's the same thing. Same thing. Right. So we're going to go a bit fast because we've got a lot to cover. This is going to be, I found this very strange when I read this, but I'll get to it in a second. So the Muslims now go back to Medina. They are exhausted, they're very tired, and here's an example of how exhausted they are. The Prophet ﷺ goes, and as soon as he goes, in his armor, he falls asleep. He falls asleep and he misses the Isha Jamaat prayer. This is unheard of. The Prophet ﷺ is always there, but for the first time, he actually misses the Isha Jamaat prayer because he is so exhausted. He wakes up the next day in his armor and he says, we are going to chase the Quraysh. Not the thing a defeated army would say. He says, we are going to chase the Quraysh who are still there. And he says, only the people who fought at Uhud is allowed to chase the Quraysh. It's mind-blowing. They're exhausted, they're wounded, and there's 300 fresh soldiers. But the Prophet says, no, you don't get the honor of chasing them out. It's the people who fought at Uhud will chase them out. So the Muslims get back on their horses. The very next day, they get back on their horses and they go to Rawa, where the entire army of the Meccans are still there. What they do is when they get to Rawa, they start lighting campfires, and they light more campfires than there are Muslims. The Quraysh think that, oh my goodness, the Muslims have gone and got a bigger army and they're coming. That frightens them and they start running away. We've heard of defeatist attitude, right? The concept of don't have a defeatist attitude. The Muslims of Medina, that's one thing they did not have. So you have to really ask yourself, were they defeated at Uhud? That they come, they sleep, next day in the same armor, they say, chase the Quraysh out. And the Quraysh go running, and Abu Sufyan again screams out to him, we will return and wipe you out. And the Prophet ﷺ responds with chapter 3, verse 173 of the Quran. He says, Allah is enough for us, and He is the most favorable. Pretty much saying, we have Allah, come if you want. But when the Muslims return, it becomes hard because they have to deal with a new problem. And the new problem is Abdullah ibn Ubay and the other hypocrites and the Jews of that tribe in that area start mocking the Muslims, saying, oh, I thought you were the Prophet. How did you lose if you were the Prophet? And they start saying, how could he be the Prophet? You just lost the battle. In response to this, Surah Al-Imran, verses 152 to 155 and 179 is revealed. I won't read that, just if you can remember it. If not, next time bring a book or a pen just to write these down. 152, 155 and 179 was revealed in response to all the mocking that the Jewish tribes were doing and people like Abdullah ibn Ubay. After Uhud, something else starts happening. The surrounding tribes, so you see there, those are all the tribes in that area. The green tribes are the ones that are allied with the Muslims. The brown tribes are the ones that are still allied with the Quraysh. The Quraysh are weakening. One after Uhud, they had a massive commercial blow. Financially, they were starting to get hit quite hard. But they're still the superpower in that region. The Muslims are still quite weak. They're quite poor as well. Like I said, they didn't have enough money for cavalry. And in alliances-wise, most of the tribes were still allied with the Quraysh. Now, these allied tribes start to cause problems. They start gathering armies because they're saying, well, the Muslims are weak, let's wipe them out. The tribes of Asad and Bani Hudayl, I don't know if you can see there, plan to attack Medina. But Prophet ﷺ gets news of this. Remember, the Prophet ﷺ, one thing he did, and this is his genius, he had an excellent intelligence service for that time. I.e., he had spies. He had spies in Mecca. He had spies in the tribes. He was getting information. If he didn't get revelation directly, he was getting information from Muslims who had converted and who were spying for him or allied tribesmen. News reaches him that these two tribes are planning an attack. So the Prophet ﷺ preempts that, goes and attacks these tribes. The survivors of these tribes are now out for vengeance. And there is a group of 6 Muslims who were trading in that region. And these tribes, the tribes of Asad and Bani Hudayl, attack these 6 Muslims, capture them. And they kill 4 of them except for 2. These 2 are Khubayb ibn Adis, who is an Aus, and Zayd ibn Datina, who is a Khazraj. They are sold to the Quraysh. The Quraysh torture them, and they not only torture them, they torture them horribly. I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, I might be wrong, but I recall that in one instance they even boiled them. They were tortured so horribly, and then they start mocking them, saying, see how you're suffering, see how you're being tortured. Don't you wish the Prophet was in your place now? This Prophet that you love so much? And their response is, both of them, they say this, we rather experience this torture than a thorn prick our Prophet. This shocks the Quraysh. One of the Quraysh actually says, I have not seen a father love their child more than the Muslims love their Prophet. And these people, while they're being tortured to death, say, we'd rather this than the Prophet get a thorn in his back or his feet. Zayd is tortured to the point that he's about to die, and he screams out, Assalamu alaikum ya Rasulullah, in his last words. In Medina, it is narrated that the Prophet ﷺ is talking to some Sahaba, and mid-sentence he stops, and he says, Wa alaikum salam ya Zayd, and starts crying. He doesn't know what's happened. But suddenly, this revelation comes, and he realizes that one of his close Sahaba has been tortured to death. Shortly after Uhud, the Prophet ﷺ marries Zainab bint Khuzama from the Amir tribe of the Hawazin clan. So the Amir tribe, that's the only little green one within the Hawazin. The Hawazin are the clan, and in the clan there's the Amir tribe. The leader of the Amir tribe asked the Prophet ﷺ to send Muslims to teach them how to be Muslims, teach them Islam. So the Prophet ﷺ sent 40 Muslims. The 40 Muslims on their way to the Amir tribe is ambushed by Bani Sulaym. Bani Sulaym is also part of the Hawazin, but they're allied with the Quraysh. So they ambush this 40 Muslims and kill all of them except one. 39 Muslims are killed. The one Muslim that remains, they said, we're going to keep you alive so you can identify the bodies and go tell who's died. So this person, this Sahaba, goes through everybody and he identifies each of them. But he can't find one of the bodies. That body belongs to Amir ibn Fuhaira. Anyone know this name? Amir ibn Fuhaira. He's a famous Sahaba, but not one of the big ones that we all know. Amir ibn Fuhaira. If you watch the Omar series, he's shown in that quite a bit. Amir ibn Fuhaira is the shepherd. Remember the shepherd, the poor shepherd? He was a slave. He used to be a shepherd for one of the Quraysh masters, and Abu Bakr frees him. He was known as one of the greatest reciters of Quran and the greatest memorizers of Quran. His body cannot be found. So this Sahaba goes, and he then goes to a group of people who killed them. And they are all in shock. And he says, I need to know where the body of this Amir is. These people say, something insane happened. And one person steps forward and says, I saw Amir, and I threw a spear at him. And as the spear hit him, he declared victory. I don't know what he said. It says he declared victory. And then he died. And then we saw his body being raised up into the sky. Now these people who killed the Muslims are saying, we saw this happen. And these same people convert to Islam on that day because they saw the body of Amir being raised into the sky. Later, when this Sahaba goes back to the Prophet ﷺ and says that these new Muslims, they said that they killed Amir, they said his body was raised to the sky, I couldn't find his body, I don't know what happened. The Prophet ﷺ says, yes, his body was raised up into the sky. I mean, imagine the level of that Sahaba's position for his entire, that body was never, you cannot find his grave. His grave doesn't exist. Now, another thing happens at this time. This is, now remember, we're talking about 1 year after Uhud, right? 1 year. So this is so-called defeat that the Muslims have suffered. They're not acting like they're defeated. They're already going and doing preemptive strikes. They're already going and sending Muslims to teach other tribes about Islam. And then there's another big thing that happens. What are the 3 tribes in Medina? You remember the 3 tribes in Medina? The 3 Jewish tribes, sorry, I'm bad. The 3 Jewish tribes in Medina. Bani Nadir, Bani Qainuqa, Bani Qurayza. So several weeks ago, we learned about the expulsion of Banu Qurayza, I think it was. Now we're going to talk about the expulsion of Banu Nadir and why they were expelled from that area. Banu Nadir invites the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to a feast. So he goes. No, I'm okay if you're okay. So he goes and he sits down. Just as he sits down, soon as he sits down, he literally gets up and walks away again. And the Sahaba say, why are you walking away? And he says, I have just been told that they are planning my assassination. And as I'm leaving, they plan to drop a stone on me and kill me. So he goes back and he sends Muhammad ibn Musalama to them and says, go tell them that I know what you were planning and you have 10 days to leave. When Muhammad ibn Musalama goes and tells them that, they don't deny it. They don't deny it, they say, yeah, but we're not leaving because we are allied with Banu Qurayza. So Banu Qainuqa was the one that was expelled. We're allied with Banu Qurayza and the Ghatafan tribe. The Ghatafan are a powerful tribe. So they're going to come and support us. We will fight you. We're going to stay where you are. But Banu Qurayza and the Ghatafan say, no, we're not getting involved in this. We're not helping you. The Prophet ﷺ sends Ali with a group of Muslims and they besiege Banu Nadir's fortress. They still hold out. For 10 days they hold out. And the Prophet ﷺ then says, cut down the palm trees that belong to Banu Nadir. When Ali and his soldiers start cutting down the palm trees, they say, stop, we will leave. We will leave because we know the Quraysh are going to defeat you and we're going to come back, and these palm trees are going to be ours again. So no problem, we're going to leave. They never came back, because the Quraysh never defeated, and Banu Nadir was never able to come back. But a question I have, and I don't know the answer to this, tell me if you know, is that we know that in the rules of engagement in battle, Muslims are not allowed to cut down trees. In this instance, the Prophet ﷺ said, cut down the palm trees. I don't know why or how. If you know, let me know. I don't.
He burnt them, didn't he? He burnt them.
I think he cut and then burnt them as well.
Yeah.
So
I think he wanted to scare.
Maybe it was an economic loss.
It was. That was the main hit. That
That's what hurt the most.
well, they didn't care about people dying. They held out for 10 days. But when the palm tree started dying, they're like, okay, we're going.
It was their business.
So they leave, and the Prophet ﷺ allows them to carry as much as their camels could carry, but no armor, no armor and no weapons. And they go to the stronghold of Khaybar, and we will talk about Khaybar in a few weeks again. On the 17th year after revelation, so this is 1 year after Uhud, the Prophet Abu Sufyan starts to get worried. So we're talking about in Mecca. He starts to get worried. Abu Sufyan is hearing news that despite Uhud, more and more tribes are allying with the Muslims, and more people are becoming Muslims. So he needs to come up with something. He needs to come up with a plan. So he thinks, I'm going to scare all these tribes from becoming Muslim. So he sends a rumor out that the Quraysh have gathered a big army and they're marching to Badr. So the Prophet ﷺ hears word of this. So the Prophet ﷺ gathers a Muslim army, and he marches, a Muslim army of 1,500, and he marches to Badr. This is the second battle of Badr, but it is also the battle that never was. Because when the Muslims arrive at Badr, there is no army. It was all a lie. The Quraysh were just making a rumor. So the Prophet ﷺ turns his army around and brings them back to Medina. But when the people in Medina and the tribes around there see the Muslim army coming back in full force, they say, the Muslims have won a great victory. Not one person has died. And the rumor starts spreading that the Muslims have won a great victory. And Abu Sufyan's plan goes the opposite. The tables are turned on him, and more people start becoming Muslim. So a lesson for those who want to play games. You know, the Prophet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, they plan and I'm the best of planners. This is a perfect example. News also arrives to the Prophet ﷺ that the Ghatafan tribe is planning an attack on the Muslims. So we're still talking about 1 year after the so-called defeat. The Ghatafan tribe is planning an attack on the Muslims. So the Prophet ﷺ sends an army to the Ghatafan tribe. On their way to fight the Ghatafan, they go through an area which is very easy for them to be ambushed. But exactly at that time, the time for prayer comes. So they're thinking, if we pray, we might be attacked. What do we do? And it is at that time that Surah Nisa, chapter 4, verse 101 is revealed, which talks about the prayer of fear. How to pray when you're in a state of fear or harm. Yeah, so I'll read to you a description, if you don't know, of how to perform the prayer of fear. This method means that the army is divided into two halves, and they take turns as they pray with the Prophet. He himself would pray the whole prayer, while one half of his men joined him for the first part of the prayer. Then they would finish their prayers individually. When they had finished, the other half would join the Prophet ﷺ for the rest of his prayers. Thus, everyone in the army would have joined the same prayer, while one half would always be free, watching the enemy and making sure they did not exploit the time of prayer in order to attack the Muslims. This method of prayer is outlined in verses 102 of Surah 4, entitled the Surah of the Women. Do you get how you prayed? So the Prophet ﷺ would be leading the entire prayer. Let's say it's Duhur, 4 rakat. So he would be praying 2 rakat, and half the army would pray 2 rakat behind him. The other half would be guarding them. And then they swap. The half that was guarding would finish the last 2 rakat, and the ones who were praying first will guard them. Will pray individually and then start guarding the people who are praying in congregation. That type of prayer was revealed at this point when they were going to fight the Ghatafan. Then the Prophet ﷺ leads another expedition of 1,000 men to Dumat al-Jandal near Jerusalem to break up a group of marauding tribesmen from the tribe of Khalab. Now here's the thing, the reason why I'm telling you this. 3 expeditions, 1 year after the so-called defeat. The Muslims at this time, the people of Medina, did not have a defeatist attitude. They did not say, oh, woe is me, we've lost so many men, oh, we don't. They actually did the opposite. They said, we were defeated in one battle, or not even defeated, we lost many men in one battle, we're going to go and do preemptive strikes. We're not going to give up. And so this map shows the 3 expeditions that happened just 1 year after Uhud. Now we are going into the personal life of the Prophet ﷺ a little bit. I've been talking about battles and expeditions, and so we'll just touch on this personal life during this time. It's at this time, in 18 years after revelation, that Hussein is born to Ali and Fatima. Then Zainab, remember Zainab bint Khuzama that I just told you that she got married? Well, she passes away. She's only married to the Prophet ﷺ for 8 months. And she passes away. Abu Salama, who is a close cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, also passes away. Now, Abu Salama had a wife who he loved very greatly, Salama. And as he's dying, he makes a dua. He says, oh Allah, let Salama be able to marry someone who is better than me, to look after her. 4 months after Abu Salama passes away, the Prophet ﷺ goes to Salama and says, would you like to marry me? And the Salama says, yes. So Salama marries her. Salama is a very important wife of the Prophet ﷺ. Anyone know why?
She told him to lead by example when they went for the first time.
Yeah. Salama had characteristics of Khadija in one sense. She was a very strong person. She was very wise. She guided the Prophet ﷺ. The other wives of the Prophet ﷺ, for example, Aisha and Hafsa, they were younger. They had their own very unique characteristics, but Salama had this characteristic that she was the strength in one sense to the Prophet ﷺ, similar to how Khadija was. Always very wise, always advising him. And I'll give an example of that. But Salama also kind of becomes the spokesperson for the women of Medina. Whenever the women of Medina have a problem or an issue, they go and tell Salama. One instance is that the group of women came to Salama and said, the Quran revelations, there's so many revelations about men and Muslim men. Why is there not much about women? And it was in response to that revelation comes down. Men and women who have surrendered, believing men and believing women, obedient men and obedient women, truthful men and truthful women, enduring men and enduring women, men and women who are humble, men and women who are in charity, men and women who fast, men and women who guard their private parts, men and women who remember Allah often. For them Allah has prepared forgiveness and a mighty wage. Quran chapter 33 verse 35. This is an interesting thing. Sometimes we think the Quran was revealed for major events or for major important people or the Prophet. Sometimes revelation comes for a group of women who just felt like they needed a verse as well, and they needed something from the Quran. And at that time, this revelation comes. Another important surah is revealed at this time. Surah Al-Ahzab, chapter 33, verse 37 to 38. Anyone know what this is? This is a very important surah in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, which, I'll give you a clue, gave him a lot of stress. This particular surah gave him a lot of stress. It is said, and here's another clue, it is said that, I think it was Aisha who said this, if he could have hidden one surah, if he could have hidden one revelation and not told it, it would be this one. Anyone know what it is? I won't tell you, I won't read it to you, but anyone know what it's about? Anyone? This was the revelation that came that the Prophet ﷺ should marry Zainab, the divorcee of his adopted son, Zayd. This stressed the Prophet a lot, because at that time, the social norms of etiquette, this was not allowed. because your adopted son was considered your own son, and therefore you cannot marry the divorcee of that. When this instruction came to Prophet ﷺ, it really bothered him. It really troubled him. And on top of the stress of what happened at Uhud, on top of the stress of losing Hamza, on top of the stress of dealing with all these outlying tribes who were rebelling, he had to deal with this as well. But an interesting thing, who helped him during this time of stress? Can you guess who helped him? Anyone guess who was the person? Well, no. Who helped him when this stress was coming onto the top of him? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself. Because it's at this time that revelation comes about the etiquette on how to deal with the Prophet. When he is tired, do not speak loudly when he's there. When he's at home, knock on the door, get permission before you just walk in. All these revelations come at this time because the Prophet ﷺ, with all the stress on him, was pushing himself to the max. He was still going and helping Muslims. He was still doing this, and Muslims didn't realize it. So they were appreciating the fact that he was always available, forgetting the fact that he was a human. He had stress. This was affecting. So at that time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had to step in and send revelation saying, stop. When he's at home, leave him alone. Or get permission.
Setting protocols and
That's right.
Operating.
It is at this time, that's right, the protocols of how to deal with the Prophet is revealed. But the Muslims, some Muslims, misinterpret this. And they start saying, look, so much revelations coming about the Prophet now. Because remember, there's relative to the other prophets, very little revelation about the Prophet ﷺ. You can see the chart. There are 4 verses that directly mention the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, compared to Prophet Musa, where there's 136. So suddenly, when these 4 verses are starting to come, they start saying, our Prophet is the best. He is better than all the prophets. And there is a story where the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is, a Muslim was having an argument. Okay. Well, I'll wrap up. I'm pretty much done. They were having an argument, and one of the Jewish persons said, he swore by Prophet Musa, and this Muslim person whacked him and said, how can you swear by another prophet when our prophet is still alive? And when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ heard this, he got very upset. And he said, no, do not do this. This is not right. You should not compare me with the other prophets, and you should not compare our religion in an adverse way. You should not compare their religion. And he was setting the protocol of respecting all prophets. So I'll end there. Inshallah, we'll pray, and then if you have any questions. Also, some of us will go have dinner after Maghrib prayer, and then we'll come back for Isha prayer. So if you'd like, join. Thank you, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Yeah. Did you get everything done?
Sort of. I got some stuff done.